In 1992, the historian Thomas Devine identified a paradox or mystery at the heart of Scottish migration. Scotland in the 19th century was in the midst of an industrial revolution, a process that would result in Scotland becoming one of the wealthiest nations in the world. Living standards, wages, and life expectancy were all on the rise, so much so that tens of thousands of people from other nations, such as Ireland, Lithuania, and Italy, were arriving in the country to secure a better future for themselves. After centuries of internal and external struggle, Scotland now stood at the forefront of technological and industrial progress. And yet, when you look at the pattern of Scottish migration at this time, there is something quite surprising. At just the moment that Scotland is becoming one of the wealthiest countries in the world, she loses almost half of her population. An estimated 2.3 million Scots leave Scotland from 1830 to 1939. To put that figure in context, the whole population of Scotland in 1825 was a little over 2 million. This video aims to offer an explanation of what happened and why. Hello, my name is Will, and I've decided to make a series of videos for students who are currently studying the history topic on migration and empire from 1830 to 1939. So this is either if you're doing your National 4 or National 5s, right up to your hires. So there are 4 sections to this topic. You have immigration into Scotland, the experience of immigrants in Scotland, Scottish emigration, and the experience of Scots abroad. And in this video, we are going to explore the reasons why Scots chose to leave Scotland. The first thing we're going to look at is the impact of the Industrial Revolution. And we are going to discuss the ways in which the Industrial Revolution pushed people away from their rural communities working in farms and moved them towards cities. We are going to look specifically at the Highlands. And then we are going to look at the condition in Scottish cities themselves that help explain why many Scots felt they could no longer stay in Scotland. The history of Scotland cannot be told without discussing the role of migration in shaping the country's future. In fact, Scotland stands out at this time for losing far more people than her European counterparts. Despite the population of Scotland rising massively at this time, over 2 million Scots choose to leave in this period. Unlike other European countries, such as Spain or Italy or Ireland, Scotland's migration was different. The general pattern was as follows. Take a poor, largely rural and agricultural country like Spain or Portugal or Ireland, and the reasons for emigrating, for leaving that country, can be quite obvious. The country was struggling to support its population. But the problem with Scotland, however, emerges when you note that, unlike other countries that experience high levels of migration, Scotland was not only relatively wealthy, but actually in the midst of the Industrial Revolution. So this meant that actually living standards in Scotland from 1830 to 1939 were actually improving. More jobs were becoming available and wages were gradually rising. And not only this, Scotland's wealth was actually attracting large numbers of European immigrants into Scotland itself. So this raises something of a mystery. The question is, why was it that Scotland in the 19th and early 20th century could be both a place of mass immigration, people coming into the country, and also mass emigration, people leaving the country? Typically, when we think of mass emigration, of large numbers of people leaving, we think of a country that's struggling economically or in the midst of a war or conflict. When Russia invaded Ukraine, millions of Ukrainians fled the country to travel further west, a period of mass emigration. This is completely understandable. What would be weird, however, is at the same time, millions of some other European nation decided to enter Ukraine at exactly that time. Typically, when millions of people are desperate to leave a country, other people are not desperate to join. So in order to understand this topic, we are first going to have to offer some kind of explanation. So what are some of the reasons that would encourage someone to leave their homeland? Here we might think about war or unemployment, economic problems. The Scottish experience of migration incorporated many of these themes, but above all, there is one key factor that helps explain why so many Scots left in this period. The most basic explanation as to why Scotland lost over 2 million people in the space of 100 years is due to the disruptive and unpleasant consequences of the Industrial Revolution. What do we mean by the term Industrial Revolution? When we talk about the Industrial Revolution, we're talking about the transition from an agrarian society, so a society in which the majority of the population are employed in agriculture, so the production of food or farming, and the transition from an agrarian society to an industrial society, where jobs previously done by hand can be performed by machines, and leading people from the countryside to work in cities of heavy industries such as coal, iron, and steel. Now, an industrial revolution is, in the long term, a very good thing for a country to experience. Ultimately, every wealthy modern nation has gone through some form of industrial revolution. However, there are many challenges that in the initial stages of an industrial revolution, a country is likely to face, and Scotland was no exception to this. And this created many opportunities, but also many problems. Industrial revolutions begin by creating a breakthrough in technology that massively reduces the number of people necessary to produce food. Imagine how much quicker a motorized tractor would be able to plow a field as compared to an individual human being. And there are two major consequences that are relevant here. So first, the more food a society produces, the greater its potential for growing its population. Given the scarce nature of food for most of human history, this has a massive impact. So it's crucial to realize that Scotland's population goes from 1.2 million in 1755 to 4.5 million in 1901. So about 150 years, the population of Scotland increases by almost 4 times. At the same time this is happening, the number of people required to work in agriculture, in farming, begins to go down. In 1841, only a quarter of Scotland's workforce worked in agriculture. And by 1910, this number had fallen to just 10%. So fewer and fewer people are working in agriculture. So what are the consequences for migration? Imagine there are 10 people working on a farm in Scotland in 1850. They are all using hand plows to plow the earth and to plant things. And then someone comes along with a horse and a much larger industrially manufactured plow that enables them to plow much faster. The landlord who owns that farm now only has to employ 3 of the original 10 people. And quite obviously, this leaves 7 people without a job. In the textbooks, you will come across a lot of terms like consolidation or landlordism. And what these terms mean, essentially, is this pattern, what we might call the commercialization of farming. A smaller number of people owning larger and larger farms that are increasingly replacing large numbers of human beings with machines. And this makes farming more efficient and produces more food and more cheaply. So a farm is said to be consolidated when it has come under single ownership. The problem, however, is that there are a large number of people who are displaced by this. People who would have formerly worked on the land are now forced to go elsewhere, to try and find work elsewhere. So the area of Scotland that is particularly affected by this is what we call the Highlands. Unsurprisingly, the area of Scotland most impacted by these changes were the most rural areas, the Highlands in particular. Particularly until the middle of the 19th century, the Highlands contributed a disproportionate number of people leaving Scotland. And the reason for this is that the communities in the Highlands were often very traditional, so comprised of small landholders eking out a small living from farming. The problem was that the culture of lowland Scotland was increasingly modern and capitalist and keen to extract the maximum amount of resources. One of the consequences of this was to pressurise landlords to evict the small tenants for the sake of profit, replacing human beings with more profitable resources like sheep farming or farming of Highland cattle. Particular industries in the Highlands that individuals would be working in, such as the kelp industry or the herring industry, so fishing, were soon to be facing economic ruin, leading people to lose their livelihoods. The final nail in the coffin for many Highlanders came when the potato famine that devastated an entire crop that was a staple resource for many Highlanders arrived in the 1840s. Here, a disease affecting potatoes had a devastating effect across Europe. Ireland was the worst affected, with as many as 1 million people dying from starvation. But Highlanders in Scotland were also seriously impacted by this. While the general wealth of Scotland may have been improving at this time, for the average Highlander, the consequences of the Industrial Revolution could be really traumatic. In many circumstances for Highlanders, their economic situation was getting worse, while for many people in the lowlands, it was getting better. Taken together, these pressures were increasingly too much for many Highland communities. Typically, the consequence was to force Highlanders to move further south, or even to consider leaving Scotland altogether. So at this stage, a picture is beginning to emerge. The first stage of Scotland's Industrial Revolution pushed people in both the Highlands and the Lowlands away from their traditional rural and farming communities towards cities. By the early 20th century, only 1 in 10 Scots still worked in agriculture. The majority had begun to live the life we increasingly recognise in the modern world, the life of urbanised city dwellers. As Scots migrated to cities by their tens of thousands because of the consequences of the Industrial Revolution, the cities themselves struggled to cope. In 1801, Glasgow's population was only 77,000. 100 years later, it was almost 10 times as big, rising to 760,000. Poverty in Scottish cities was notorious. To illustrate this, compared to Britain, over 60% of Scots lived in 1 or 2 roomed houses, compared with only 7% in England. The pace of Scotland's transition from an agrarian to an industrial country resulted in cities being overcrowded with poor sanitation, leading to the outbreak of diseases like tuberculosis and cholera. And despite all the progress of industrial change, Scotland remained a low-wage economy. In 1860, Scottish wages were often up to 20% lower than for equivalent English trades. The crucial point to realise here is that Scottish people at this time are becoming increasingly mobile at home. A large number of Scots are becoming increasingly willing to move within Scotland. Having already broken ties with their local community, moved to a city, disrupting their old lives, many Scots were now increasingly open to the prospect of moving even further away. The pressure of industrial life was great for many. While industrial wages may have been superior to farming wages, they were also vulnerable to a boom and bust cycle. From 1830 to 1939, there were several periods of serious unemployment in industrial areas. In the 1840s and 1850s, as well as in the aftermath of the First World War, the Great Depression of the 1930s. It is not surprising that in these decades, Scottish emigration was at its highest. So we can now do a brief recap of what we have learned about Scottish migration from 1830 to 1939. Firstly, we introduced the mystery or paradox of Scottish migration, noting that unlike other countries that experienced high levels of emigration at this time, Scotland was an increasingly wealthy and industrial nation. Wages were improving and economic opportunities were growing. Despite this, Scotland lost over 2 million people to outward migration. So we try to give some answer for this mystery. So why was this? Well, in simple terms, because of the Industrial Revolution. While in the long term, the Industrial Revolution had good consequences for Scots, in the short term, it had a very disruptive impact. In the Highlands, the impact of the Industrial Revolution on farming and industry was often negative. Highlanders were forced out of their land in great numbers by an increase in rents, as fewer people were needed to work the land. Many Highlanders moved further south to cities in the lowlands as a consequence before leaving Scotland altogether, while the potato famine in the 1840s accelerated this process. Meanwhile, in the lowlands, the growth in cities provided opportunities but also problems. While skilled labourers were in demand, often industrial wages were poor and the conditions in cities could be even worse. So that brings us to our conclusion. In the next video, we will see how the factors pushing people in Scotland to leave were accompanied by factors pulling Scots to join other countries. So we're going to be looking at the positive factors that are encouraging Scots to leave Scotland. So hopefully you found this video useful. Please comment below on anything that you liked or didn't like. This was my first attempt at making a video, so there's definitely some room for improvement. And finally, if you're looking for a history tutor, I am currently accepting students, so either individually or in small groups. So send me an email at whawktutoring@gmail.com. Thanks, and see you next time.